Welcome to the Open Source Exchange, everyone. My name is Kendra Morton. I'm our Principal Product Marketing Manager at Revenera, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. And we are so thrilled to have you for what's bound to be a great panel today. So why are we here today? So in previous installments of our Open Source Exchange events, we focused on topics such as the evolution of the software supply chain relative to license compliance and security, the impact some high-profile security vulnerabilities have had on global organizations, and the role regulatory bodies and specific regulations play on open source and third-party component management, just to name a few of our topics that we've had in the past. All of these are highly relevant for legal practitioners, but we wanted to get more specific for you, for this specific audience. So today we're going to discuss the legal side of compliance and security in M&A and software auditing. Today's discussion will help you learn more about what's happening relative to the software supply chain, what possibly affects your thinking and strategy in M&A and other due diligence events, and setting legal best practices for helping your clients and your organizations through the potential complexity of open source use, especially when it comes to open source license management and consideration. Okay, so with that, we want to talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about. So in today's panel, we're going to address three main topics. So the first topic is legal due diligence and M&A in today's environment. And then topic number two is the role of open source and third-party code audits. And our third theme topic is the evolution of open source licenses. And so we're very excited to dive into that. But before we do, I think we need to get our panel introduced. Andreas, I think we're going to start with you. Andreas is from Bitsy.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andreas Kutula. I'm the founder and the managing director of Bitsy. We focus on software analytics and the management of open source. We consult our customers on open source management processes. We do open source software audits. Bitsy has been around for 14 years now, and we are a member of the Open Chain group and also of the Bitkom, which is a well-known computing organization in Germany. And I'm very happy to be on the panel today. Thank you, Kendra.
Great, thank you, Andreas. Michael, next from Revenera.
Hi, everyone. Again, good morning and good evening to some of you. My name is Michael, and I manage the professional services team at Revenera. I'm responsible for the software composition analysis services business here at Revenera, which includes our product-related training as well as the global audit services. Prior to this, I worked at Palamita as a senior analyst. I've managed audit process. I've been in the software composition analysis for about 16 years.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And Marty, also from Revenera.
Hi, Marty Melican. I'm a Vice President and Associate General Counsel here at Flexera at Revenera. And my role, I am ultimately responsible for everything that is legal related, including, but not limited to, open source compliance, both from a consumption perspective and then assisting with our own software composition analysis tool on their side.
Thank you, Marty. And Felix Ronan from Adobe.
Hello, everyone. I'm Felix Ronan. I'm a senior software composition analyst at Adobe, an auditor for short. I have over 10 years of experience in the SDA space. Prior to Adobe, I was at Revenera as a consultant on their professional services team. And that's where I trained up my current team at Adobe on auditing and FlexNet Code Insight usage. And then subsequently, I joined the team myself.
Very good. Thank you, Felix. We're so glad to have you. And our resident open source exchange, we've had him on quite a few, Leon. So good to have you again from GTC Law Group.
Yep. Thanks, Kendra. Hi, everybody. I am a principal at GTC Law Group, and we are a little bit unique amongst the law firms out there, is that we have an entire group that's dedicated to this open source compliance and due diligence practice, rather than just a couple of lawyers that sort of moonlight doing this from time to time. So we do a lot of M&A work with third-party software, And we do a lot of guidance for people. Before I became a lawyer, I wrote software for almost a decade, which seems like a lifetime ago. And I did that starting at a startup. And then after the dot-com bust, very much for a multinational healthcare company because they were big and did not go bust. And what's another sort of neat thing about us is that that's not unique for us. So many of my colleagues are also former software developers, and that lets us, I think, at least communicate with the developers that we have to communicate with a lot better. We speak their language. So that's what we do. We do a lot of diligence during M&A. So this is going to be fun for me.
Very good. So thank you. And thank you all. We're so glad to have you here today. And with that, let's get started. We're going to jump into our first topic, legal due diligence and M&A in today's environment. All right. So our first question, so what role does legal counsel and lawyers play in open source management, and has that evolved? And I know it feels like I should throw this to one of our very definite legal experts, but I'm going to start with Andreas, because I think when we were talking through some of these topics, he had a kind of unique perspective here. So Andreas, would you mind starting off for us?
Yeah, sure. We actually had a very interesting experience with these M&A activities with regards to open source management. So when I look back 10 to 12 years, the open source audits were important in M&A activities, and we conducted them for many company purchases. But at the end, when we presented a result, very often the security team jumped on the results first and checked if there are any security issues. But nowadays, this has very much changed. So we see that the legal teams look into are very keen on getting the results and understanding what the license implications are. So the recent experience we had was actually 2 M&A activities from one company. And for the first company, everything went pretty smooth. So the company which the target was well prepared. They had a good understanding of what an open source compliancy is. And they were very responsive for everything we discovered in their code, problematic or copyleft licenses. They could clarify that immediately. They could find out how the components are linked together. And it was just good working with them. And that process also went very nice. And then the interesting part was the second company shortly later. They were totally unaware of what this open source management is. They were unprepared. They did not understand. They had no clue what copyleft or permissive licenses are. And it all ended up that the M&A process was stopped at some time. So that was a very interesting experience to see how deep the law agencies and lawyers looked into the code and how important it is to successfully run an M&A process nowadays.
Very good. Thank you, Andreas. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think one thing that's definitely true as we progress is 10 years ago, right, you sort of have to convince people that you as the acquirer are going to do a code scan, and then you're going to do your diligence, and you're going to review. Nowadays, I think that's expected, right? No one fights it. There's, if you're on the sell side of a transaction, I don't know what justification you would use, right? And I think that the level of review is different, right? It's no longer just a check the box exercise, right? We did the code scan, we got the results, great. Let's move on, right? So people are starting to ask the smarter questions, right? How are you using these things that we've now found, right? What's being done. So I think, it'd be interesting to see what others think, especially the non-lawyers in the room, because I'm going to say that I feel like the lawyer's role in M&A is to sort of quarterback the thing, right? And so naturally, now I want to know if I'm way off base here and others feel differently. But yeah, you sort of, and one other thing too that I always like to say is, it's by nature, M&A is adversarial, right? You've got the sell side, you've got the buy side. Everybody's trying to get the best deal for their client. That's just the nature of the beast. But if there's an area during M&A that's sort of cooperative, this has to be it. Because at the end of the day, whether you're the selling company, whether you're the buying company, you need to know what's in the software. You need to know that you're in compliance with licenses, whether if you're the seller, if the transaction doesn't happen, right? You still need to be in compliance. If you're the buyer, you need to know that you're buying clean stuff here. And then at the end, generally, right, the people being acquired are going to work with the acquirers. So you're all going to end up on the same team at some point. So in that way, if you make the process, the diligence process, a little bit more cooperative, a little bit sort of less painful for both sides, I think that goes a long way.
I think that's right. And Leon, I know you kind of seem to try to pull in some commentary from non-lawyers, but as a lawyer, I'm going to jump in and say a couple things because I generally agree with you. I mean, quite frankly, as Andreas mentioned, right, Revenera was just purchased about a year ago, right? So I got to see, again, right, I've seen it a few times in my career, but I got to live that kind of I'm being sold. How do I prove to the acquirer that we have our ship in order, right? We have our ducks in a row. And quite frankly, that process was the questions that we were asked by counsel for the buyers were way more in depth than anything that I had come across prior to when I was on the sell side of transactions previously. They're relatively consistent with what we ask when we're the buyer, but I had never been through a process where we were being sold where they went to that level of granularity. And it really did make the process go a lot easier. It brought a lot of attention out of the room. And I quite frankly, I thought that for a lot of the questions, while the lawyers were asking the questions about the technical compliance and whatnot, the programs that we ran, the business people in the room were really listening to it as kind of a proxy for just how sophisticated are we, right? They want to know that. And quite frankly, we do that when we're buying. When we go look at a software company and we want to buy them, we ask open source for all the legal reasons, but our business people care about it because it does show a level of sophistication, maturity, or lack thereof, right? And I think, Andreas, that was kind of your experience too, that there are some targets that just don't take this all that seriously. And while that's okay, that's their right to do it. It does really speak volumes when you don't have that process in place as to how it is you run your organization generally, and really starts to raise some questions.
Yeah, so we mentioned we had this maturity model that really, you can see how mature an organization is also within their processes on how they can handle these requests.
Okay. So, and all of that, right, and in terms of the role that, you know, lawyers play, legal counsel play, right, it speaks to some of that complexity. And so then given where we're at today, you know, there's more threats, more bad actors, there's more regulations in terms that look at open source and third-party code management, right? Software, everywhere you turn, the software supply chain security and talking about the software supply chain, right? There's articles that's in the news. How has that changed for each of our panelists, not just our legal professionals here, but how has that changed each of your roles today? Marty, can you start us off, please?
Yeah, it's actually been, I mean, this is going to sound strange, but to a certain degree, it's been beneficial, right? Because of some of the bad stuff that has happened, it has really highlighted the risks that are out there. And as open source professionals, those on this call, we all know that the value of open source is immense. And so we love the idea of making sure that we are able to allow and help our organizations leverage that technology to move both our organizations and the open source community forward generally. But some of the bad things are what we needed to, I think, bring up to the level of attention for our C-suite folks, kind of what is out there from an open source perspective. And, you know, in a lot of situations, the lawyer can be the person who points out the problems. But with open source, I've actually really enjoyed the ability to kind of take this and saying, hey, these are opportunities for us to improve or get better or move forward. And so you can really take, your reputation of being the person who's always pointing out risk to saying, no, here's how we can solve these problems. And the tools that are out there and the role that we get to play is really more about not killing deals per se, but actually saying, no, okay, yeah, there's a risk there, but we can leverage these various other things to move us forward. And so it really has changed me from check the box. I think someone already has used that phrase, but really in as a partner as we move forward through that M&A process, because after you do the diligence, you then need to identify the areas that you, as the new owner of the company, how are we going to change on a go forward basis? How are we going to be able to solve some of those problems? And I'm rarely finding myself saying, oh, we can't buy this company because of all the problems with their open source usage. It's more along the lines of, hey, don't worry about the open source stuff. We're going to be able to address all the risks and concerns. They're a mature company that got the solutions in place. We need to tweak some things on the back end post acquisition, but it really has enabled me to be more of a problem solver than simply someone who points out risk.
It speaks to what Leon said, right, about being the quarterback. Like if the quarterback was always there just to say no, right? What fun would that be in any kind of football game, right? So,
Yep.
All right. Thanks, Marty. Michael, how about you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I just think, and others will agree here, that open source itself is treated differently today, and it's not the same today as it was, 10, 15 plus years ago. I remember, my experience attending events where companies were invited to talk about their use of open source and the third-party codes and the tools that they use and the processes that they had in place. First of all, there weren't that many companies attending, and from what I can recall, those companies were very reluctant in sharing very specific information to other companies. They didn't want to disclose a lot. They didn't want to disclose the processes. They just didn't want to disclose that in detail. And I remember speaking to one of the people there from one of the companies, and the person said to me, "Look, I can't share details because then everybody will think that we may have some issues." And that's how it was a long time ago. But kind of time goes on, and today it's complete opposite, right? I mean, we've got various organizations that were created, many initiatives that were formed, standards that were created, and so I think that there's a lot of collaboration. My role has changed as well, and everybody's role here probably, because now we have to educate ourselves and try to understand what's going on in open source community as a whole. Because of all these new security threats and new regulations, new standards, we not only have to stay on top of the kind of the latest news in open source, but we also have to be ready to pivot to change the process when necessary and adapt.
So there's a constant education, right, that we always talk about for our clients and our customers and those development teams, but that doesn't change for us as well. It's always a continuing education for those of us who are focused on this every day.
Oh, absolutely. And especially when it comes to open source licenses, right? I think the number of times that I've read the GPL, for example, either version is probably in the high thousands, right? And yet every time you read it again, you go, oh, well, did I think about this, right? So I had a friend call me out of the blue yesterday and talk about the Mozilla public license, right? Because that's what we do for fun. But yeah, and it was something that I hadn't thought of. Right. And like I said, I've been doing this for years. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know that works, but it's interesting enough to sort of talk about it and talk it through and see how it fits in. And just to go back to what Michael and Marty said, one of the things I'm going to key off of the regulations part of this prompt here. I think it is extremely helpful to have the executive branch of the federal government essentially come out and say what you've been saying all along. Right, because fortunately or unfortunately, but definitely rightfully, the president has a little bit more sway than we do. Right, so when there's an executive order that says, well, you have to have a software bill of materials, you have to be able to know what's in your software, you have to be able to tell others so they can review what you've put into the supply chain. That's very helpful because that's something that I think all of us here have been saying for years. Right, and that's where we can point to that and we can say, yeah, look, see, this is coming, and right now it's coming for your government contracts. But do you really think that your large clients, your large customers, are not going to ask for the same thing?
Absolutely. Okay. Anyone else? How it's changed your role today?
So, I mean, I would say my priorities change alongside legals because as an auditing team, we take our cues from our legal teams. So, if they tell us to prioritize certain types of components, like components from certain banned countries or certain commercial components or new codec implementations, we're going to add those to the top of our list of items we specifically need to focus on or be aware of. And then we might create new MID rules, which allow us to automate finding those specific components. So, as there are new like executive orders, security breaches, etc., we kind of reprioritize what we focus on as our top priority, at least.
Very good. Okay. So given all that, how do you think, how should development, security, and legal teams work together, right? We've called out that, our legal representatives are probably the quarterback, but how should they all work together? Maybe Andreas, you could start us off there.
So when we look back some years, we could also see it was a very linear process. So at the beginning, we had a development team. When they completed their developments, then there was some assessment. The open source components were extracted. Then there was a legal team with the evaluation, and then there was some result. And that made development really slow when some issues were detected. So what we see today, that there is much more interaction between all these different teams. Even during development, whenever developers want to integrate a new open source component, then an open source office or team right away does the assessment. The legal team gets in and can judge, is this component really usable in the how we want to use the software at the end? Is it distributed? Is it just some internal stuff? Do we link it together? And all these questions are answered beforehand. And so the open source process is much, much faster than before. So I think that is a very big change. And that's also how people should work together. It's more a cooperative model than a linear model where you can just take the results from one stage and put it to the next. Many things also the lawyers cannot answer without input from the development team. So there needs to be lots of communication during that process. And that's also in the open chain process that is recommended for open source management. There's also a nice model where all these teams work together, and it's a very interactive process.
Good.
Yeah, and in the M&A context, right, if we're asking questions, we're on the buy side, right? The sell side absolutely needs to get their developers over the wall so that they can answer them, because otherwise diligence doesn't happen and then nothing works. And then for everything else, it's exactly like Andreas said, right? We're all starting in the same place. We're starting from that software bill of materials, and then everybody's got to weigh in and review, right? Again, during M&A, you want everybody's input because, and even not during M&A too, right? There's no point in approving something from a legal standpoint if from a security standpoint it's a no-go, right? Or from a development standpoint, it's a no-go. You're wasting effort.
And Liam, I definitely agree. Again, having just gone through that sell side perspective as well, what you do want to make sure you can bring your engineers along. Honestly, I think my ability to talk about the feedback loop nature of our process gave a lot of confidence to our buyers that we had done things correctly along the way. And while absolutely I needed to bring in some engineers to speak to, well, exactly how do we use this component? How does it deploy it, et cetera? The ability for me to answer most of those questions without them, because we were in sync, the way Andreas kind of talked about, there's this constant feedback loop between legal and security and engineering as to what all the different things we're trying to accomplish are. And that I could speak to a lot of those because of that feedback loop really, really assisted in getting our buyers comfortable that the software that they were going to get as part of this acquisition was in a good place.
Yeah, and I think you hit upon the exact point that you don't, as the seller, don't wait for M&A to start figuring out how you're using your open source, right? Because if I'm doing the diligence and Marty sends me over a software bill of materials, and for every possible component that I might have a legal question about, he's got a little note that says, oh, and by the way, this we only use internally as a testing tool, or this we don't link with our product, right? It makes my job very easy. And it makes it very easy for him because then, yeah, he doesn't have to bring those developers over. They've already done the work.
Yeah. Right. And it speaks to the maturity we have, right, Leon? You see that exactly. And you say, oh, these people know the issues that they're supposed to be looking for. They have a process for managing them, and they have the knowledge to be able to communicate that.
right? And the output actually matches the process, right? We've all seen it where somebody hands you a 20-page long third-party software sort of compliance document. This is our policy. This is our process. And then they hand you their software bill of materials, and there are things on there that they shouldn't have approved. Right? You're like, okay, so that was a waste. Thank you. Let's try again. So, and one thing that you'll notice, I just said third-party software. We've talked about open source a lot, right? We'll keep talking about open source a lot, but really, it's any third-party software. It's all sort of, it all is a compliance exercise for us from the legal standpoint. So when we say open source, pretend like we're saying third-party software.
Absolutely, and always. Felix, I'm interested in your perspective as kind of our security expert on the panel in terms of how, given everything that we've talked about, all the changes in the industry, kind of what that relationship looks like between development, security, and legal teams.
Well, I'm more on the legal side at Adobe, but I kind of think that, all three teams should align in like a collective mission to strive to reduce the number of severe vulnerabilities that are in their code, legal and security.
Yeah, and I think your perspective is very relevant too, because not all organizations are the same in terms of how they're like you are in the security space, but you're very focused on legal side, and that may not be the same for other organizations, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have a separate team that handles the security aspect.
Yeah, got you. Okay, very good.
I've just one idea to add to what Mike, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, one sentence to add to Leon's experience with the how people come up with these 20 pages of open source components. We were in one M&A audit where the target gave us their list of the bill of material, and they had like 10 million lines of code, and they said, we're using these 5 open source components. And so that's just, you could see that they did not look deep into it. So you can tell that right away from how they react. I just wanted to add that to Leon.
Funny but not, right? Funny but not.
It happens all the time. It's not usually that broad, right? It's not usually, oh, we only have these 5 things. But yeah, people are often very confident that they know what's in their code, but if they haven't actually done the work, right? If they haven't actually done a scan before and they haven't actually reviewed it, then chances are they're woefully unprepared to find out what's actually in their code once the scan is complete. And Andreas, just to go back to that, when I said, so when I mentioned the 20-page open source policy, please don't take that as something you need to produce, anyone that's listening to me. I think any third-party software or open source policy that's longer than 2 pages is A, never going to work, B, never going to even be read by anyone other than lawyers doing a deal, and C, just don't, right? A policy should be nice and short and easy to implement.
Very good, very good. So let's go to our next kind of question within this topic. So are you in your day-to-day, are you having conversations with companies or conversations internally, really, that lead you to believe there's more awareness about open source and third-party component security and compliance? Is that happening? Is it not happening? Kind of what are you seeing within your own organizations or within your own space? Marty, perhaps get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been with Revenera now for coming up on 12 years, and not to pull the covers back too much, right? To Michael's commentary about people not wanting to share too much of their dirty laundry per se, but there was much less awareness and focus on it back then, for sure, right? It was one of those areas that, coming in, it was one of many things that was in my remit to ultimately kind of get my arms wrapped around. And we are in a much better position today than we were in 2005. Or no, 2010 when I joined. So yeah, absolutely. And the pushback I got then compared to the pushback I get now when I go ask a question about this topic is markedly reduced. And there's way more collaboration about it, right? The engineers want to get this right? And which is the beauty of open source, right? Most people who leverage open source recognize its value and the benefits that they get from it. And as a result, they take their obligations seriously. And that's ultimately what we want to do ourselves and then help our customers do as well. And so, yeah, there is so much more awareness about it. There is openness about it, and there's excitement about it, which again, back in the day, it was probably just the engineers who kind of knew it, right? That Andreas's story about 10 million lines of code, but only 5 open source components identified. Maybe in '97, when I first started working for the .com, that might have been true, because everybody was building a lot of proprietary code, right? A bunch of engineers head down in a room, throwing a product together for a little .com. It's not the way the engineers work today. They like the more Lego model that we have, where you're pulling different building blocks and there's all this crowdsourced knowledge for each of these components to accomplish these objectives. And so, because the shift in, I think, that software development process, the legal and the security issues that are associated with it, and the fact that these engineers they're engineers at heart. They want to get it right. They value that. And then they kind of like the ethos, the philosophy behind open source. And I think all of that knowledge has kind of come, we're at a point where that's well known across all these different groups. And as such, the willingness to work together and partner on making sure that things are being done well and properly is much greater than it was even a decade ago.
Very good. Very good. Hey, Michael, how about you?
I just think that, no. Okay. So kind of on the topic of awareness, at Revenera, so many of our services engagements with respect to code reviews are initiated because of the M&A activity. And, we are the third-party vendor that requires COM2 to do this, this type of engagement. And so in the past, we'd have these conversations with 1 or 2 people on the call. We'd have 1 or 2 people join. They don't even know why they're there. They know that they have to do it. Somebody told them to do it. And, again, they just didn't know why they were there. They didn't know much about open source. Nowadays, it's the complete opposite, right? We find ourselves on the calls with, 10, 15 people. Everybody has a role. Everybody understands. I shouldn't say everybody, but many people understand the concept. Many people understand the idea of why, why this engagement is being done. And again, most people are now aware.
Good to hear.
Yeah, I think, one thing that I've noticed is that it's not just traditional software companies anymore that are aware of the fact that they need to look into this, right? So we've had clients that just have really tangentially nothing to do with software, but they are a software company, right? Because they have a website that sells their products, or because they have a kiosk somewhere. Essentially, at this stage in the game, right, you sell toasters, you're probably a software company because there's software in those toasters. And they're a household device, which creates its own problems. So yeah, it's the awareness is spreading. It's not just sort of the core people. And to everyone's point, it totally makes sense to develop software in the way that we're developing it now, right? You have these projects that have been out there for a very long time. They're peer reviewed, they're peer sourced. They are very good at doing what they do. And then the secret sauce of your software, the really cool stuff that you can do, gets built on top of that. You don't have to waste your time reinventing the wheel, right? Nobody wants to write the TCP protocol all over again, right? There's just no point to it. So yeah, open source is a very, very good thing. All we have to do is just make sure that we're using it properly. I think just a lot more people are sort of aware of how it works now. And that's thanks to things like this and Open Chain and others, right? Just sort of putting the information out there.
We like to say like everyone is a software company these days, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a small price to pay to ensure you're in compliance for all the access that you get to already written code, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, as was mentioned before. And our teams are very eager to get IP code audits done. Our inboxes are full of auto requests. So our teams are, well aware that even if they're not super well versed in open source licensing, they know they need to get the audit done. They know they need to be in compliance. And our legal teams provide extensive guidelines and guidance for regarding open source license usage.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to a growth and maturity that every organization really needs to understand what they have, right? It's not that you have to be 100% perfect, right? But just know where you're at in your maturity in terms of open source and third-party code management, And there's always room to get better. So yeah, good point, Felix, for sure.
And even when we talk about everyone's a software company. I love the toaster analogy. I think that is spot on, as some of these toasters are pretty amazing these days. But even if you truly do not produce anything, right? Mm-hmm. You consume so much software, right? A bank doesn't actually produce anything, but they consume so much software in order to run their business today. And they are absolutely concerned about what's behind their firewall, right? And so if you're going to ask your customer to deploy your software behind their firewall, they're going to want to know what's in that, period, full stop. And they've hired people to help them understand that and make sure that they may not necessarily care so much about that license compliance part of it, although they should, but they're going to definitely worry about making sure you know what is in your product so that if there's a problem, you're able to go find it and you're able to go fix it and you're able to close whatever vulnerability your software just created in their environment. And if you can't honestly say that to your customers, you're doing a pretty big disservice to them, and they're not going to stand for it for much longer.
We're also seeing that in in the companies or big corporations in Germany. They started several years ago with setting up their open source offices and managing. And they now have a clean house, and now they are requesting all the suppliers to also deliver the bill of materials to look at the open source. Now you see that's cascading through the industry, that more and more people need to take care of that. And I think especially in Germany, there were many, many lawsuits with regard to wrong usage of open source licenses. And that was like a wake-up call for many of the companies that they need to do something, because they want to avoid being in the news for misuse of open source.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. You don't have to be sued for things to go poorly for you, right? Whether you're in Germany or elsewhere. All it takes is one tweet to go viral that says such and such company is misusing open source and they're a bad actor in this environment, and poof, right? Bad things happen.
Yeah, very good. And I do like that, I'm glad we have that perspective for you, Andreas, too, right? Because there is a difference sometimes in the regulation, what's out there, what's in the US versus maybe some European locations or elsewhere in the world. So it's really good to have that perspective. So, gentlemen, I need to move on to our next topic. So thank you so much for that great discussion. So our second topic is the role of open source and third-party audits. Michael, this question to you first. What is an open source or third-party code audit, and when is it important to conduct one?
Sure. So I think that before I answer that question, it's important to understand how software is created, especially for someone who is not technical, who isn't familiar with open source. And the important part here to understand is that the large percentage of the code that makes up the third party, or that makes up your product, it comes from the third party, it comes from somewhere else. It's not your code, it comes from a different origin. And so the open source audit, is a code review process that detects and identifies these third-party libraries, these third-party licenses. Okay, typically the result of the deliverable of the open source audit is a document, some sort of a document that lists these third-party licenses and their components and sometimes vulnerabilities, security information. We call a document a software bill of materials, or SBOM for short. It's basically an inventory of all these findings that are detected during this code review process. Now when it's important to, the second part of the question, when is it important to conduct an audit? Well, the most obvious reason that comes to mind is doing an M&A. If you're preparing for an M&A, or if you're going through an M&A, it's almost a requirement nowadays that, you produce this complete list of materials. Another reason why, if you are, to avoid facing any legal action. So, if you're a software provider and you distribute your code, you really need to know what third-party software resides in your code. If you have to, comply with these third-party licenses, you have to comply with these third-party licenses to avoid any potential legal, infringements. Only way for you to know what's in your code is to do an audit. These are probably the most common reasons why you would do audit. There are other ones as well. For example, companies that want to go IPO, or there's divestiture and investment. you're outsourcing your development and you want some sort of assurance of any possible license infringement there, or if you want to know the security risks, these are different reasons, when then you will need to do this audit.
Very good.
I think another answer there would be if you've never done one before, right? I mean, that's kind of how you get this started, right? I mean, if you really haven't done one, if you've been relying on a policy between legal, security, and engineering to manage what components go into your solutions, that's great. That you've got a good first step in place. But a policy is only as good as your ability to enforce it, and then your ability to validate that it's actually working. And so, to me, that audit needs to be done. If you've never done one before, now is the time to do one, right? Because all these other events that Michael talked about that may trigger a much more time-critical need for the output of the audit is just knowing all of that up front before you get into those situations. For those of us who work in M&A, a lot of the time, there is not a lot of time to get an M&A transaction closed. And the more things you can do prior to that, the better. And then again, these audits should happen periodically, regardless of your level of maturity or the level of enforcement of a policy, because at the end of the day, the policies are only as good as the people implementing them, and nobody is perfect. And so you do need to have that kind of cycle set where you do these audits periodically to confirm that your process is working. And if it's not working, it gives you an opportunity to change that process so that you get a better outcome next time. Because I don't know, Michael, have you ever done an audit and compared it to their policy and gone, oh, look, we didn't catch anything that you wouldn't have otherwise led into your ecosystem?
We did. We catch everything, but
Right.
but most of the time our engagements are because of some triggers, right? I think it's because of the awareness and education. We do have, on and off some companies who come to us to, we call them baseline audits. Just companies want to know what's in their code. Never done one. They're now educated and they want to know what's in their code, so they come to us. Not as many of those as the ones caused by some type of trigger.
And just to add to that, I think it's very important, this continuous short cycles to do the audits. Very often when we come to a new customer, they are really astonished when they see how much effort it is to go deeply into the code. So when you do this baseline audit and you have a whole Android system or a whole Linux system, that's a massive amount of work to get that well done. But if you do that frequently in parallel to the development, these open source audits or the Delta audits can be done in very small steps, and it's always just a couple of days to do that. I think that's also very important. And we see more and more customers doing that. So once they have seen this initial effort for the baseline audit, then most of the development teams, they want to have this continuously to at any time be ready and not suddenly be surprised by huge effort that needs to be spent to get the bill of materials.
Very good. What current trends? I know, like we do at Revenera, we put out a kind of a trend document at the beginning of every year, and I know a lot of other vendors do as well. So we can speak to a lot of trends. But what trends are all of you seeing, and how's that, especially when it comes to auditing or scanning code, and how's that changed, do you think, over the course of the last few years? Maybe Michael and Felix, I think you've got probably a little bit more experience in this too, maybe Andreas, but maybe we can start with you guys.
So from our sure, thank you. From our perspective, we're seeing a lot more package managers. I think that's the case for corporations all over the world. That's just the trend that's been going for a while now. We're seeing a reliance more and more on microservices. Mm-hmm. We are seeing a lot more containers, Docker, Kubernetes, mm-hmm. And also a lot of cloud services and products.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Okay. And again, we had a lot of number of M&A audits, and the open source concept is becoming more popular, more people savvy. Some are not still, but again, the trend is more and more people understand now what open source is, and security is also kind of part of the process now, which it wasn't before. People, I would say 10, 15 years ago, they didn't know what went into their, code. We get a disclosure sheet from, kind of back to Andreas' question, we get a disclosure or comment. We get a disclosure when we finally do produce the actual report. We see that they still miss a lot of components, and so that sort of stayed the same. I think the percentage of people who provide a disclosure versus what's in their code, that stayed the same. They didn't know back then. They kind of still can't account for everything. In 2021 and 2022, what we've noticed is the increase in demand of forensic audit levels of audit. That may be due to to that executive order that was signed by the Biden administration last year. But there's definitely more demand for that. And these are the very deep audits that require, mainly snippet analysis. We're seeing more of those, as time goes on. We're seeing a lot of third-party dependencies. They're very common nowadays. Pretty much every project that we have, they have these dependencies. So node modules, PyPy, Golang packages, Ruby gems. We're seeing increase of statically typed languages. Rust, for example, is the newer one that's coming up. Package management tools. We're seeing significant rise in deployment scripts, build systems from recipes like Helm, Chef, Docker, etc. Let me see what else. Again, dependencies, I've mentioned that. Many people involved. I think that the biggest change here is that we've seen many people being involved in the project from every organization. Before, as I mentioned, we've seen one or two people. They grab the process. Now we see teams of people. Everybody's got their own unique role, unique responsibility, and that's a positive change.
So you said at the top when you were speaking, Michael, you said that more security. Did you mean more security people, or did you mean from a just overall security vulnerabilities, or security within your code is more important? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that in the past it was there was separation between security and IP, and so we would be asked to do one thing, not the other. And now that as more awareness comes and more education, more people now understand that they're sort of interconnected a lot, right? I mean, you're not going to have a whole view on the whole security view unless you know the full and complete, and accurate SBOM, right? So you've got to go through an audit. You've got to produce a full and complete accurate SBOM for you to get your vulnerability stuff right. So now everything's together, and again, we see more people on the calls with security background, security expertise, not just IP.
I
think what. Go ahead, Marty.
I was going to say, as a software producer ourselves, I've watched the progression go from open source compliance or third party compliance being primarily driven by legal. Then the security issue really kind of has arisen, and security professionals are understanding that this is a source of concern that they need to make sure that they are able to address from a security perspective. And then most recently, I think the latest group to come to Revenera and say, hey, we're concerned about your open source consumption. Please help us understand it. Please give us visibility via your SBOM, is our customers, right? And that's partially driven by regulatory changes, but a lot of it is driven by their maturity level with respect to understanding the role of open source, again, kind of on the systems behind their firewall. Although again, as a cloud provider ourselves, a lot of them also care about what is in our cloud solution. So even though those products are never going to live behind their firewall, they do still care about it from a security perspective, right? And so when I think of who I have conversations, it used to be just lawyers, then the security people showed up, and now our customers are asking for it as well. And that's really just driven, I think, by the awareness of these issues. And to Leon's earlier point about software being everywhere now, that's the reality, is that we're going to get these requests from each of these different constituencies. And as a result, we have to be prepared for those conversations and put our best foot forward to answer and address their concerns.
So if we look on the trends that we can see, I think it's mainly two. It's standardization and automation. If we look some years back, every company would introduce their own open source management process, and everybody would reinvent the wheel. And nowadays there are good templates that you can reuse for the processes and all the methods, and companies are using that. So they take it like a blueprint and just adapt it to their processes. So that's a great help that we get from the standards like the ISO 5230 or the open chain standard that was developed. That is a great help, and we see many people using that. And the other trend is the automation. So as Felix and Michael have mentioned, we see that the usage of open source components dramatically increases. Some years ago, it was just one system. Then we got these repository managers. Now we have containers everywhere. So the numbers of open source components is just exploding that you have in a product. And you cannot handle that in a manual way anymore. And there we see that many customers try to automate as much as possible to, in their tool chains, put in tools that automatically detect whatever is there and automatically produce the bill of materials. And also in the automation, the reuse is one important part. So that whenever you have audited one piece of software, you have detected some components. In some other project, you may have the same component again. And when you have automation and this reuse, that also reduces the effort and enables you to handle this massive amount of open source components.
So, real quick, we've heard a lot about Log4Shell and followed by that Spring4Shell, those vulnerabilities. I thought maybe we were kind of moving through it, but I think I just saw an article maybe at the end of last week that, another bad actor within a company had taken advantage of that Log4j vulnerability. So it's worth talking about. But do you think that those high profile issues like Log4j and Spring4Shell, have they had an impact on organizations and their willingness and strategic focus on securing the software supply chain?
I mean, at a very high level, sure, right? When the CEO is reading his Wall Street Journal and on the front page it says, hey, are you using Log4j, right? And the first phone call he makes is to somebody who can answer that question for him, right? And if you can't, then all of a sudden you have a problem, right? I think Marty has said that before many, many times, right? That's not the time to find out if you're using it, is when you're getting that phone call. So, but yeah, I'm sure that the security folks here will have many, many more things to say than that.
I think that's right. I view those events as items that they certainly do kind of spike up interest in this topic really quickly. I think people have short memories, and so it drops down again. But I think if you were to chart a level of interest and a level of awareness over time, it's going up and to the right, and you'll see those spikes around these types of interest. We're not going to stay at that level of interest at the C-suite level. They've got enough things, varied things that they have to focus on. It will drop after each of these ones, but I don't think it'll ever drop below where it was before. And so that'll continue that upward trend to the right.
Mm-hmm. I think these events or these occurrences of these security issues, they are like an eye-opener for many people, that these software components, you need to manage them like any hardware part. And I often use that example. If you look at the car, if you go to a car manufacturer, they can tell you for every screw and every part they have used in the car, they can tell you in which car, in which model it has been used, how often it has been used. So if there's a problem, it's easy to find the cars where it has to be replaced. So if you ask them for a specific piece of software, and if you go to any person or any company and you say there is this open source problem, for example, in Log4j, where do you use it? Nobody can answer that right away, just because the software is managed completely differently. And with these incidents, many people realize that the software needs to be managed in the same way as these car components or hardware components.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
And we also had a number of customers who came to us specifically telling us just because of these issues, because of the Log4Shell and Spring4Shell vulnerabilities, we need to do further analysis, and they've asked us to kind of look deeper at their code base, and in case of dependencies, they didn't care about direct dependencies only. They now cared more about transit dependencies, and they wanted to look, 2-3 levels deeper.
that ability to do more of a forensic scan, Michael, is what you're talking about.
Both forensic and just a broader, like in the past, companies were more concerned about the top-down view, just kind of big rocks, we call them, libraries that are there, and now they just want to know everything, right? Specifically because of Andreas's point, if someone comes and says, where do you use log4j, they want to be able to pinpoint those places, and what they're finding out is that they've got it right, and many different versions, and then they start asking why and looking deeper into it.
Yeah, very good. All right, we are going to move on to our third theme, and that is the evolution of open source licenses. So recently, open source projects, most maintained by commercial companies, they changed their licenses. Some of them did. They went from being, what's considered business friendly to perhaps more restrictive. So what are some examples and why did they make those changes? And perhaps, Andreas, if you could lead us off here. Or you're on mute, Andreas. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, sure. There are several open source projects where we have seen that some time ago they had very permissive licenses, and suddenly they are introducing more and more restrictive licenses. So I think Grafana is a well-known one, or the Elastic or MongoDB, and all of these software, it's all open source, mainly driven by individual companies, and they have started changing their licensing model. There are several reasons behind that. So I think most of the time it is because they see that they are not getting the business they are wanting to have, or they see that the open source that they produce is misused by other participants, especially in Elastic. It's a search engine, and they said they could see that other vendors or cloud service providers, they are using these services and they are making millions with their code, but not contributing back to the open source community. And then that is a good driver to change the licensing model, not to allow the usage of open source to everybody. So they want to get something back into the community. And that's also what Grafana or Anaconda, they all had similar reasons that they changed their license. They don't want to bear all the cost alone. And for that reason, they recently changed their licensing model.
So Andreas, in that scenario, you used the phrase that they viewed their license, their technology as being misused. You didn't mean that from a legal perspective per se. The users were complying with the open source licenses that they had been, that had applied to the technology deployed, but it was more of a philosophical difference, right? They believed that there should be something more going on, and that was why they changed. It wasn't a legal issue per se, it was more philosophical. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. It is like the idea was we work in a community, everybody works together, somebody takes and you also give. And then there were some companies or people just taking, and then this model gets out of balance. Mm-hmm. And we see that especially in projects which are mainly driven by single companies. So they have a business model in mind. If you look at open source projects that are driven by a big community, the risk is not that high that the license suddenly changes. But if you have an individual company who has one open source project, they somehow need to create revenue out of it. And that can be with services or with premium features or anything like that. So they need to have some model which gives them the money that they can survive.
Really speaks to, again, when we talked about continuing education, staying on top of it, right? Being very strategic in your approach to open source and third-party component management, right? How quickly things do change and licenses do change. So to stay on top of that and stay on top of your policies, for sure. What's the potential impact to end users, right? And you know, getting to what I was just talking about, what should they be doing? What should organizations be doing when it comes to, you know, staying on top of all of these changes and license and security management?
So this can have a really dramatic impact to organizations. For example, if you look at Redis, that had a very friendly license in the beginning and now suddenly changed to a license which made it basically a commercial product. And you could not use it anymore in your own product with the new licensing model that you have. So that's very restrictive and that can ruin your whole business model. So you need to be very careful in deciding which open source components do I use in my products. And when there is a high risk that the license model suddenly changes, that can have a severe impact to your own business model. Just one other example with Elastic and AWS. So Elastic changed their licensing model, especially due to what Amazon had done with how they reused the components and then sold them and made millions of dollars out of that. But nothing made it back to the originator of the source code. And so that was seen as an unfair behavior. All fully legally compliant, but still not, it was not good for Elastic. And so they had to change their business model.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then I believe Amazon came out and forked the last Elastic project that they could, and they created a competing product. So that's always the sort of the elephant in the room, right? So MySQL gets bought by Oracle, the world freaks out, and all of these other MySQL-like databases spring up, including MongoDB. MongoDB, much later on, changes their license. Everybody freaks out. There are going to be new databases that are going to spring up, and then it's all sort of a little bit cyclical in this way. But to Andreas' point, when you're looking at a piece of software, whether it's commercial or open source, that's foundational, right? You're going to build your platform on top of this. You're going to build your software on top of this. Be really careful about what you're choosing and stay on top of these license changes. And it's always good to sort of at least have a path. Like if somebody comes up to you tomorrow and says, "You got 2 months, you got to rip this out." Right? What's the path? Is it possible, or is this something that you're going to have to potentially then pay a commercial fee for, if you can? Right? Sometimes the license change is such that there is no commercial option. Right? It's just becoming more restrictive as far as the open source license.
And I think that staying on top of it is important, Leon, right? Because you give an engineer 2 months to solve a problem. Maybe that's okay. Maybe it's workable, but maybe it's not, right? I don't know necessarily what's in my engineer's roadmap. And so if I drop in and say, guys, you got 2 months to change something, that could go over really, really, really poorly. We had a situation recently where actually our security team was the one who identified this. And this kind of goes back to the interplay between these three groups. Our security team was noticing that our engineering team was using an open source component that was a couple of versions behind the current version. And when they dug into it, the reason that the engineering team hadn't moved on to the more recent version of the open source component was because the open source component's license had changed as it moved to a new version, and the new version was not permissive in the way that we needed it to be in order for us to use it the way we had been using it. And that's okay for a time being, but again, the security person's observation, and legal obviously agrees, is that because you're now a couple of versions behind, if there does turn out to be a vulnerability in that older version, your path to solving that problem won't be to just upgrade to their latest version, because their latest version is likely to be on a non-permissive or not appropriate for our use case license. Therefore, you need to start identifying that migration path should that event occur. Great, continue to use that version a couple of versions back. But you need to be prepared. Otherwise, to Leon's point, I will be walking in there, or security will be walking in there and saying, vulnerability was discovered. We need to get that component out right now. How do we do that? And if you don't know the answer to these questions, if you haven't been following these particular issues, you're left scrambling. And again, in this case, we were lucky, right? We were kind of getting ahead of that. But again, they're in the process of looking to that alternative right now. If a vulnerability pops tomorrow, they'll be under the gun. And so they're living with that pressure of knowing that there is a clock ticking, but they don't actually know when that alarm is going to go off. It could be 6 months, it could be tomorrow, right? They just don't know. But without knowing anything of that, they would be completely unprepared, and it would be a problem.
And you have to, I mean, I think staying on top of it, you have to, there's no other choice. You have to be proactive. You have to, rescan constantly, right? I mean, it's one of those get clean, stay clean models, right? You got to have a process in place. I think it comes down to basics, right? Education, having a process in place, people, roles.
Yeah. And then on that, you talk about the stay clean, right? One of the aspects of staying clean, and I think, Andreas, you touched on this a little bit, as did you, Leon, right? When you look at the open source component, you can't end your analysis with, is the license appropriate for what I want to do with it, right? You need to go a little bit further. You need to go and look at, is this code coming from a single source? Yes or no? Because if it's single, well, then they completely control the license selection for V2, V3, V4, and thereon. And therefore, you are subject to that risk. If it's a larger community, that risk comes down considerably, right? Are they a commercial enterprise or not? Like that, these types of things need to be considered, not just that license analysis, right? It's a license analysis. It's a security analysis. Are there known vulnerabilities? How quickly have they historically solved these problems? And then it's also, and who owns the project? Who controls the project? And what is the likelihood that project may take a diversion into an area that we don't like?
Yeah. Sorry, Marty. And one other point I wanted to kind of reiterate is what Leon said. You have to, I'm losing train of my thought. I forgot. I'm sorry.
So, because I think what we're talking about is when we say you got to stay on top of this, right? But what does that mean exactly, right? What does staying on top of this mean? How is it putting a scanning tools in place? Is it putting a policy in place? Is it putting a team in place, like developing an open source program office, something like that, right? So are we talking about all of those things? Is that what organizations need to do? Or
I remember it was the the remediation part. You have to have kind of the plan B in place, because if you don't, this is where your bottom line can suffer, right? I mean, you've got an issue and you have to go in there and rip stuff out. You got to stop production, and that affects the revenue for the company, right? So having some sort of a plan B in place, and that definitely is one of the things that we preach.
Very good, right? So in addition to that, right, having remediation. Yeah.
Correct.
Right, and you don't need it for every third-party component, right? You're using 20,000 components. You don't need a remediation plan for every single one of them. But I think, as Michael said, right, for the ones that are really, really core, right, or the ones that you think are vulnerable.
Exactly, the critical ones, those that form that make your business, that are very important for you, or those that are difficult to replace, that you heavily use.
Yeah, that's one of the questions we always ask our engineers is, so if I say no to this, right, if I'm, as legal or security says, no, you can't use this component for whatever reason, what's your alternative? Do you have one? And it's usually a question I ask more from a pressure testing perspective. Even if I know I'm going to say yes, I will always ask that question just to get them to start thinking about and helping me understand where does this particular component fall in the scope of critical to non-critical, easily replaceable, not easily replaceable, right? Because again, that now enables me to flag that and say, okay, from a management perspective, I need to have this level of diligence associated with this component. As Leon mentioned, there are so many components in there. You cannot give each and every single one of them the exact same level of love and attention, right? You have to give them all a baseline level, but once they're in there, you have to really be able to kind of triage and understand, where do most of my risks lie? Where do the most critical risks lie? And make sure you have the appropriate remediation plan to as great a degree as you can anyway in that.
Yeah, there are many, many ways to prioritize review, right? And you absolutely have to focus on the things that are worth the time and money first, because you will always run out of time. And sometimes you'll also run out of money. Right. I don't. I think most people think that third-party software review is a lot more expensive than it actually is. But usually, and especially, to take us back to M&A, right? On M&A timing, if you're manually reviewing every single component that somebody is using, you're never going to get there, right? You're going to go way past signing, way past closing. It's not a good use of your time. You have to be able to prioritize by product, by type of component, type of license, type of use.
Yeah, I think legal needs to be proactive in identifying kind of the most troublesome recent changes and then communicate that to the product team so that they kind of align and get on the same page.
And then from a policy perspective too. Sorry, Leon, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I was just going to say that all of us have that list, right, of entities and or projects that we're keeping an eye on because they've either had problems in the past or because we think that they might.
And you can again operationalize some of this, right? Your intake, when you're doing an evaluation, right? That process of asking those right questions, right? Who owns it? How singularly focused is this? What is the commercial? If you put all that stuff into your process on the intake side of the third-party code that you're bringing into your solution, you do ultimately end up with a much better roadmap to help you get out of anything that you might unfortunately find yourself in.
And that also brings us back to the question we just discussed before. How important is a good open source management? So if suddenly you see one of the licenses changes, you need to be able to find out which of my products are affected and how are they affected and where do I need to change something. And when you do not have a good overview of the usage of your open source components, you will not be able to answer this question.
Very good. I'm going to move on to our final question here, at least for this topic. So, we're talking about the evolution of open source and open source licenses, and we've talked about some of those changes, right? But given the nature of what's happened over the last, couple of years with the popularity, for lack of a better word, of security, with those, kind of high profile security breaches, is the conversation changing? Should it change? Where does license management kind of fall on relative to importance in the scheme of things? Who wants to jump on that first?
Quite frankly, I think the answer is, yeah, it has changed. It's going to continue to change, and it needs to continue to change, right? A lot of these issues, none of us will have the benefit of experiencing all of the issues and benefits of open source in any given moment, right? The issue that we were just talking about, that Andreas was talking about, right, where a license changes kind of from one version to the next. I had not encountered that before, quite frankly, and ironically, I encountered it for Revenera on the internal side. And then it was a topic that we wanted to talk about here. And I was excited because I was like, oh, I just learned about this myself. And Andreas has already given it some thought and enabled, his thinking enabled me to kind of build from that and say, okay, great. Now I understand a little bit more about how this happens, why it happens, what I need to do in my process to change from an intake perspective, in order to hopefully avoid or at least be able to address and manage this particular issue when it arises next time, because it's going to come back next time. It will happen again at some point.
Yeah.
So the ability to kind of build is good.
Yeah. And it helps to shape your conversations. I think you were talking about that earlier, right? It helps to shape your conversations internally, the relevant
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's a new angle, right? Again, as we talked about earlier, when I go to the engineering team today to talk about open source compliance, it used to be like, oh, here comes the lawyer talking about licensing again. I don't know, whatever. Okay, great. Now they take it a lot more seriously because security is usually with me as well. But now they really do kind of get it and they understand it. And as Andreas mentioned, there's a philosophical component to it, right? That idea that we should be giving back to the open source community, that this is all about lifting everything up together like that resonates with them. They are, at the end of the day, the engineers, creators, right? They like that ethos, and they are therefore much more excited and much more willing to work with me to help make sure that our usage is in compliance with that general philosophy of open source consumption. They don't always like my answer when I tell them, no, they can't do something. It's not going to work. And there's more of a legal reason than a technical reason, but they get it, right? And they understand that. And quite frankly, we recently just had someone ask if they could use a GPL component in a way that they weren't supposed to. And until I kind of mentioned the idea that whoever wrote this code wanted it to only be used in this way, and that's different than the way you want to use it. They put themselves in that engineer's shoes and really were able to come along with me on that journey and say, okay, I get it. I understand that that's not the right code for me for right now for this particular deployment. And that change has been really, really good to see.
Okay. All right. I think we're good. I think we've reached the end of our segment. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank all of our speakers. What I'd like to do before we kind of close out today, and just a reminder, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A tab. But I would like to go around the table one more time, and I'd like to ask each of our panelists to provide a key takeaway from today's discussion, or perhaps not from today's discussion, but anything that they feel is important for you, our audience, to understand about the legal side of license compliance and security management, of securing your software supply chain. So let's do that real quick. Andreas, would you mind kicking us off, please? I think you might be on mute again. No worries. No worries. All good.
Yeah, so I think when we look back 10, 15 years on M&A activities, the open source compliance was seldom a major point which was looked at. And that has very much changed. So I think today the technical part of an M&A has a much bigger importance, and it is a huge effort to be compliant. So my main to take away is be prepared. Prepare beforehand and continuously work on the open source compliance.
Very good. Very good. Michael, and we do real quick, I do recognize we have a question from our audience. So Heather, you asked that question. If you mind just hold on, let's get through this and then we'll jump to your question when we get go around the table here. So Michael, could you please go ahead?
Yeah, so I think to get the full benefits of using open source, you must properly manage it and properly secure it. And not having a complete and accurate SBOM, possibly not complying with the license requirements or upgrade requirements can expose your organization to possible, litigation and security risks. And so, you can't fix the problem if you don't know about it. So I guess the key takeaway here is that I urge every company, every organization to be proactive, take some time to understand what goes into your code, get an audit done if you haven't done that yet, have a process in place, have a remediation plan in place, educate your developers.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Michael. Good point. Marty.
I'm actually going to key off of Andreas's last comment, which he used the word continuously. And that to me is really what open source management and compliance is all about. It is continuous. It does not stop. It does never end. It needs to continue through this cycle. And I think the other component to that continuous nature is that the constituency that you need to bring into the fold and be concerned about continues to grow, right? Again, it used to be, first it was just a software engineers writing code, then legal got involved, then security, now the government's coming in. And now, like I said, from a Revenera software producer perspective, our customers are coming in and asking for information about our usage and management of open source. And that is going to continue to evolve over time. And as a result, your efforts around open source need to be of a continuous nature. Otherwise, you will get left behind.
Very good. Thank you. Felix.
So my takeaway is companies can no longer be ignorant of what third-party code their developers are using. It's just too much of a liability these days. And the way they can earn the trust of their customers and retain it is to stay out of the headlines when there are major security breaches or when there are lawsuits announced.
I love that idea of being a trust organization, right? And showing that you're implementing the right best practices. So that's a great point, Felix. Thank you. And Leon.
Well, so the benefit of going last is I can just say ditto. But yeah,
Not
no,
gonna let you get away with that, no.
I don't think I've ever limited myself to one word before in my life, so that wouldn't work. No, everything that everyone said is absolutely on point, and absolutely perfect. And what I typically like to add is that open source compliance is really not as costly as most people think it is, and the tooling has gotten tremendously better. So, you know, a few years ago, you can get away with saying, look, I don't have a notice file. I have 10,000 components. How do you expect me to go and collect all the notice files, right, for example? But there are tools out there that'll do that for you now. One thing that I didn't want to go back to, and it's something that Felix and Michael both said, right, a lot of use of package managers now. And package managers will absolutely spit out a list of dependencies, right? That's a good starting point. What they don't do is they don't find snippets. And if the vendor you're using for your code scan also doesn't find snippets, that's a gigantic miss, right? So make sure when you're selecting a vendor is make sure to ask them if their solution fits what you're trying to do, right? And if it doesn't fit what you're trying to do, keep moving, right? Find a vendor that works, because otherwise, if you have holes in your software bill of materials, that's the foundation, right? That's where everything starts from. If there's stuff in there that's missed, you can't have great results downstream.
Very good. Thank you. Great points from all of you. So I want to get to one of our audience members' questions, and it's a two-part question. So can you talk about your auditing team or how you've seen other companies set up their auditing team? So like look at it from a size perspective, where they sit in the organization. Do they sit within legal? Do they sit within security? Other? That's first part. And then how do they interact with the open source office that an organization might have established internally? Or are they part of the open source office? So does anyone on the panel have experience with what they've seen in other organizations? Maybe.
I guess I could take that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So we work with many companies, and we've seen just different ways companies attack the auditing piece of it. What I think works best, and this is what we've seen from our experience, is a centralized auditing team. So if you've got a big organization and you want to, or a small organization and you want to audit your own code, it works best when you have that centralized auditing team. It's easier to train these people. You know, you've got dedicated auditors. That's their job, right? You can't. You know, we've seen companies who try to have their developers or the leads of a product, you know, the product managers scan that product. That doesn't work well, I don't think. So it's when you have the centralized auditing team whose job is just to do the audits day in, day out. That works best.
And Michael, where would you recommend, or where have you seen, in your perspective, where do those people live in an organization? Is that a legal function? Is it security? Or is it someplace else? You said not engineering, yeah. But where would you advocate a client if they were asking your opinion?
Yeah, so it could be engineering. But as long as it's dedicated people, right? We've seen it different ways, and I guess it doesn't really matter where they live. In the past, not so much in security, but it was more legal or engineering, or a separate, it's just a separate function. Could have been under just separate. I don't even know. It's none of the two that I mentioned, but but again, as long as the people's job is to solely do audit, because it's easier to learn, it's easier to track different changes that are going on in the out there in the community, and it's easier to train people. If you spread it too thin and you give access to every engineer to scan their own code that they bring in, that gets too messy. And I've even heard that some exploit that, right? And they're going to change things in a way where the product won't pick it up. But we've seen it all over the place.
Felix, you said, right, you guys mainly deal with legal, correct?
Yes, even though we are on the security team. But we've been kind of bounced around, or prior to my arriving at Adobe on the team, they were in legal and then moved to security. But primarily, we communicate with our legal teams. And again, a security team handles a different team handles like vulnerabilities. But we are a centralized source for all IP legal audits. And in that sense, it does work for us because we are the experts of what we do. And product teams come to us with questions, and, within the limits of our roles, we can answer a lot of their questions.
Very good.
And Felix, to Michael's point, you're dedicated, right? That's what you do all day, every day, right? And that's
24/7.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that part of the answer here for her is too, that it's, you take a look at your organization, because there's lots of factors. No one organization is really the same. You take a look at, how big or how small, right? And then kind of what works for you. Yes, you could, you definitely, I would say yes to answer her question. You interact with the open source office. I think that's a given. That's a must. And it could, yes, at some point they could be part of that open source office, right? And perhaps that changes down the road as your business requirements and your business needs change.
And as she thinks about where it lives, I mean, I usually would focus, and every company is a little bit different. Every C-suite is a little bit different, but I would focus on determining where I believe they could live that will give them the most power to accomplish the objective, right? If you're in a company where legal is kind of off to the side and not particularly relevant, I wouldn't put them there, because they're not going to necessarily have the gravitas that is necessary in order to address this cross-functional thing. If you have a COO or chief operating officer or something along those lines who kind of has a remit pretty broadly across the business just to get things done, that might not be a bad spot to do it. But again, I think that analysis from my perspective would need to be done first to say what reporting chain gets them to a position where they can actually accomplish their objective.
Very good. And unfortunately, gentlemen, I got to leave it there. So we're at the end of our time. Thank you, panelists, to our audience. Thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to perhaps having you at future open source exchanges that are yet to come. If you have a topic you would like us to discuss in the future, let us know. Type it in the chat or the Q&A section. And as a reminder, don't leave without checking out our resources. I think I keep calling it resources. It's really the handout section to the right. For our legal audience, be sure to check out the Software Composition Analysis Certification course. We wish all of you continued success and hope to engage with you again soon. Panelists, once again, thank you. Audience, thank you. Take care and have a great day.